I would like to open this first at-home homecoming
by recognizing that McGill University is on land which long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst Indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. We acknowledge and thank the diverse Indigenous people whose presence have enriched this territory on which peoples of the world now gather.
En cette toute première édition des retrouvailles virtuelles, permettez-moi d'abord de souligner que l'Université McGill est située sur un territoire qui a longtemps été un lieu de rencontre et d'échange pour les peuples autochtones, notamment pour les nations Haudenosaunee et Anishinaabe. Nous saluons et remercions les divers peuples autochtones qui ont enrichi de leur présence ce territoire qui accueille aujourd'hui des gens de partout dans le monde.
So yes, like I mentioned, my name is Chubi Nebe. I'm the McGill VP Institutional Change for the McGill Black Alumni Association. Currently a second-year law student at the Faculty of Law, and I did my undergrad at the Desautels Faculty of Management and graduated in 2016. Thank you for joining us today for this homecoming event, the last event of McGill's 2020 at-home homecoming. In normal years, obviously, homecoming would be in person with friends, family, and alumni all on campus. This year is very, very different, but I'm extremely happy to be able to have you all join us today, as well as our moderator and our panelists for our community conversation called Has the Grass Ever Been Greener? Anti-Blackness in Canada in the era of COVID-19. So just to start off, I wanted to contextualize the land acknowledgement that we just heard. As most of you know, this has become a very, very important practice for any event that's being organized in Canada, but really in any, at the end of the day, colonial country, to acknowledge the stewards of the land who have been on this land for time immemorial and still continue to guide us as we try and understand how we can reach a point of greater equity in our country. As a Nigerian-born Canadian, for me, I'm still trying to navigate my own identity as a settler, but I think it's very, very important to recognize the solidarity that Indigenous peoples have been showcasing for the Black community, as has been done for the Black community showcasing solidarity for the Indigenous populations throughout this current moment, but also throughout history. The experience of Blackness in Canada and indigeneity in Canada is one that is very different in multiple regards, but also similar in different regards too, be it in the context of slavery that in Canada affected both Black and Indigenous populations, the dynamics of colonialism that still continue to affect both populations. I think it's very important that as a Black person and as the Black community, we recognize the importance of the stewardship of our Indigenous siblings on this land. So when it comes to this event, I just wanted to also take a moment to contextualize how this event came about. I think we can all acknowledge that we're currently living a moment that seems like unlike any other, beyond the unprecedented nature of the pandemic. The resurgence of the movement for Black lives and the reckoning that has resulted in terms of addressing anti-Black racism. It's something that hasn't been experienced in decades. And for me, in acknowledging this, I think it's very important that as we as Canadians, we continue to have these conversations and continue to unpack anti-Blackness in Canada. For me, it was very critical that we have an honest and candid conversation on the nature of anti-Blackness in Canada, and we do it from a position of humility in recognizing that we're not any better than our American neighbors when it comes to the treatment of Black populations today and historically. In the context of McGill, for example, I think it's very important to recognize that McGill University, my alma mater and is my current university, has a legacy in slavery. As was documented in the Slavery at McGill University Bicentennial Recommendations report that was written by Dr. Charmaine Nelson and her student authors, James McGill was someone who enslaved Black and Indigenous peoples. Specifically, he had 2 Indigenous children, Mary and another unnamed child, as well as 2 women of African descent, Marie-Louise and Sarah Cavalry, as well as another man of African descent, Jacques. These 5 individuals served as or were enslaved by James McGill. And I think it's very important that as we have these conversations on anti-Blackness in Canada, that we recognize the roots of anti-Blackness as something that has existed in Canada for centuries. So in organizing this event as well, I also wanted to take a moment to acknowledge the ongoing demonstrations that are taking place in the US and across Canada, especially the protests that are taking place still in the US right now following the grand jury indictment of only one officer in Breonna Taylor's killing. That indictment, although for some it may seem like justice, in reality it isn't at all because there's still no accountability whatsoever for the actual killing of Breonna Taylor. So with this event, as we have these conversations, I just want to recognize that this is a moment for everyone to understand the responsibility that we have to play in fighting anti-Black racism, be it in taking to the streets, putting the truth on paper, or advocating for a more just society. We all have a role to play, and we all have to recognize how we've been complicit in the oppression of Black peoples. So for me, this event is just one way of contributing to this ongoing movement, and I hope it's just a continuing of the conversation that we all need to be having with one another and as a community. So quickly, in terms of administrative aspects of this event, we're going to be having a moderated conversation between Brittany Williams, who's a moderator, as well as the 4 panelists who I will introduce shortly. Following this conversation, we'll have a Q&A where audience members will be able to submit questions throughout the discussion, as well as during the Q&A period. And for a half hour from 3 onwards, we'll actually have the chance to ask some of these questions to the panelists to continue the conversation. So this entails, right now, you can use the option to submit questions. There should be a question feature in the webinar. So please use that. As you have any ideas, feel free to send them along, and they will be collecting those questions. So without further ado, I will introduce our moderator and our panelists. So first, as our moderator, we have Brittany Williams. She graduated from the McGill Faculty of Law in 2019 with a Bachelor of Common Law and an LLB. She's the former executive director of the Legal Information Clinic at McGill, which is Canada's largest student-run clinic, and she's currently the Programs and Strategy Manager at Girls Action Foundation, a national charitable organization that leads and seeds girls programs across Canada to reach over 60,000 girls and young women. So as our panelists, we have the pleasure of being joined today by Desmond Cole, who's an activist, a freelance journalist, author of the best-selling The Skin We're In, A Year of Black Resistance and Power. If you hadn't read that book, please, right after this, go to a library, go to a bookstore, purchase the book and read it. It's actually incredible. He was the former host of a weekly show on Toronto's News Talk 1010, former columnist at the Toronto Star, the author of a groundbreaking personal essay, The Skin I'm In, that was featured in Toronto Life, and that sparked a national conversation on anti-Black policing practices in Canada, in Toronto and across the country. He was also the star of the CBC documentary, The Skin We're In, that was based on that Toronto Life essay, and then marked a distinctly Canadian contribution to the Black Lives Matter movement in 2017. So thank you for joining us, Desmond. We also have on the panel Anthony Morgan, another alumni of the McGill Faculty of Law. He graduated from the faculty in 2012 with a BCL and an LLB. He's currently the manager of the City of Toronto's Confronting Anti-Black Racism Unit. He's the co-founder and co-director of the Sentencing and Parole Project, which is a non-profit organization that prepares enhanced pre-sentence reports for Black people marginalized by poverty and racial inequality. He's a former associate at Falconer's LLP and one of Canada's top racial justice lawyers. He's appeared in front of the Supreme Court of Canada, has twice represented the interest of African Canadians before the United Nations human rights treaty bodies. He's a frequent legal, social, and public affairs commentator, has been featured in the Globe and Mail, National Post, Toronto Star, CNN, and is currently completing a Master's of Studies in International Human Rights Law at the University of Oxford. So thank you for joining us as well, Anthony. Thirdly, we have Anna Maria Inanajor. She also graduated from the Faculty of Law same year as Anthony in 2012 with a BCL and an LLB. She's currently a partner at Ruby Schiller and Inajor Di Giuseppe with a focus on criminal, constitutional, and regulatory law. She's the executive director of Cannabis Amnesty and one of Canada's most vocal advocates for cannabis amnesty. She's an adjunct lecturer at Queen's University, or former law clerk at the Supreme Court of Canada for Justices Marie Deschamps and Richard Wagner, as he then was. And she's also been featured in the Toronto Star, the Globe and Mail, the Walrus, and TVO. And finally, last but not least, we have Emilie Nicola. She will be joining us shortly by video, but she will obviously be taking part in the conversation. She is an anthropologist, a human rights advocate, the co-founder of Quebec Inclusif, a movement that actively unites citizens against racism and social exclusion. She's a weekly columnist at Le Devoir, a radio columnist for CBC Let's Go, a political commentator on CTV's Power Play, a political commentator on CBC's Power in Politics as well, and without a doubt, one of the most vocal advocates in Canada and in Quebec for racial equality, for racial equity, and for social justice. So thank you, Anna Maria. Thank you, Emilie. Thank you to all the panelists and the moderator. So as you can tell, we have quite a stacked lineup of really, really just incredible voices that I'm very, very eager to share. So in that regard, I will let Brittany Williams take over.
Thank you so much, Shubi, and thank you to all of you who are joining us from everywhere today. I'm really honored to moderate this panel of accomplished and influential individuals, and I'm also aware of the vastness of this conversation, what people want or need to hear, and the approximately 45 to 50 minutes that we have to pack everything in. So we're going to jump right in. Hello, Emilie, welcome. So I think it'd be important to start with kind of a check-in. I really appreciate that you all are here lending your voices and experience to this conversation around anti-Blackness in Canada. And so, yeah, I think it's important to check in. So I guess a question for each of you, or every one of you. How are you? How has the pandemic affected you, your families and loved ones? How are you adjusting? And how are you coping? I can, Anthony, would you like to start?
I was hoping you wouldn't ask me first. But you could have a whole panel on that in and of itself. Of course, COVID is reshaped much of our lives. But to be brief, I think I'm managing okay. It's been a shift. Everything from, because of the work that I do at the City of Toronto, being responsive to the disproportionate or the disparate impact that COVID has had on Black communities in the area of employment, food, housing, transit, and you name it. It's been quite busy, and you couple that with the upsurge in conversation around anti-Black racism. There's been a lot, and then there's balancing that while also dealing with daycare being shut down, and also having my little one, and trying to make sure that I'm as present as I can be for her while navigating all this. So it's been a lot, but I give thanks that everyone's okay, more or less.
Desmond, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, thank you, Brittany. And thanks to Shubi as well for all your organizing to make this. What can you say? I don't know what to tell you. Like, seeing what's happening right now with kids being back in school and all of the uncertainty and instability in so many people's lives, I hate it. I feel like, you know, very, very fortunate at this time to just be able to do the basics, to be able to pay my rent and have food and stay at home, because things are so uncertain right now. And at the same time, I know I've felt very energized at times by what's been happening in this country. Certainly the tremendous, like, 6 months of unending protest, in certain parts of America, in places like Louisville, Kentucky for Breonna Taylor, many, many months of resistance across the country in the United States. And then after the murder of George Floyd, I think that invigorating things that we were already talking about here in this country. And I've been out in the street a lot. I've done demonstrations. I've gone to demonstrations where we we're marching for people who were murdered by the police, but I've also gone to sites of eviction where when they told us there were no evictions during this pandemic, we're still seeing people be forced out of their homes or forced out of public spaces, as with places like Moss Park in Toronto, because that's the only place that the homeless have to be because our shelters are certainly not safe during this pandemic. I wish we weren't living in this moment. I wish things were different. I wish things were better. But in those moments that I have felt, I don't know, more alive because of the resurgence of energy, I guess I get lost in those, and we're fighting and we're pushing back and we're acting in service of one another. And I do feel better in those moments throughout all of this turbulence.
Thank you, Desmond. Anna Maria, how are you?
It's been a whirlwind, both professionally and personally. So at the beginning of the pandemic, so I'm a criminal defense lawyer, and a lot of my work is in courts, visiting clients in jails, and having access to them. And at the beginning of the pandemic, when everything went into shutdown, one of the things that was most frustrating to me was my lack of ability to have access to my clients and to my courts and to the places where you have to go to fight for justice for people to be released. There was a huge movement right at the beginning of the pandemic that really targeted the jails and prisons as places of increased vulnerability for people, as basically hotbeds of places where COVID-19 could easily spread and make people who are already quite sick, already quite vulnerable, increasingly so. And the lack of care both south of the border and north of the border in terms of trying to get people out of jails, trying to stop people from being incarcerated when it was not necessary, really frustrated me. I have to say, though, that the work that I did at the beginning of the pandemic, trying to get people out of prison so they're not going to be vulnerable, showed me that there's a really different approach to prosecution in Canada than there is in the United States. Prosecutors stepped up and to the extent that they could, tried not to put people in jails. Now that sort of raised in my mind the question of, well, why aren't they doing that anyways to begin with? Why does it take a pandemic for you to realize that incarceration isn't the way to treat people? But it was a really interesting experience, and the beginning of the pandemic really, for me, focused around trying to get people out of positions of vulnerability where they would be stacked like sardines and incredibly vulnerable to the spread of COVID-19. And as we know, our jails and our prison populations are disproportionately Indigenous and people of color. They're also a growingly older population, and they're a sick population. So we have these intersecting degrees of vulnerability that made me very, very worried for my clients and for the people that we have in custody. Then the second part of the pandemic was that during the pandemic, for a large part of it, for the entire part of it, I was pregnant. So I was, when the pandemic struck, I was about 7 months pregnant, which meant that because of my, that it was considered a vulnerability, I couldn't go to court, I couldn't go to jails, I didn't visit police stations, I couldn't be with my clients in the way that I wanted to because of my personal vulnerability, the vulnerability of my body and the child that I was carrying. And that made me feel helpless in many ways. And that was very difficult because I wanted to be out, I wanted to be protesting, I wanted to be in courts when courts were shut down. There were calls for volunteers to go to court and to talk about, to go to court and to be able to stand up for people who don't have a voice of their own. And because of my vulnerability, I was unable to do that. And so that was very difficult for me. And then the other part of what the pandemic made me realize is, you know, I'm quite, it was just, once I had my child, my baby, I was just hit by a sense of immense gratitude by all the people who stepped up in my community to help me, to make sure that I can continue to do the work that I was doing, to support me, and it just made me very, very proud to belong to my community, and in many ways to my country, because I felt very supported, and especially with our healthcare system. We have a very strong healthcare system, and there are difficulties with our healthcare system. But if I compare with my family members who are living in the United States, the cost and vulnerability of having a child in a country is quite different in the United States, especially as a Black woman, than it is in Canada. And so it made me feel a sense of gratitude to live where I do, and to have this strength and the community support to continue to do the work that I did.
Wow, that's no joke. No joke. Emilie, would you like to check in? How are you?
Hello. You guys have a lot to say about how you are. I feel like, I don't know, it's hard to follow, but I think I'm doing okay, and there's a lot of us who kind of feel guilt when they feel okay in this period. So I'm not doing badly, and there's kind of a survivor's guilt effect to it that I think affects a lot of Black folks right now. But I'd also say that I feel kind of disoriented, and I think that's a lot of us feel like that, especially this year. But there's a lot of variables that have always been in place that have been shaking up, I guess, in the last couple of months. People that in my head were just lost battles. People would never care, who just all of a sudden they saw this George Floyd video and now they start having some sort of interest in something, and that's very disorienting in a way. And I think a lot of us have learned to at least I've learned to not hope for anything of a certain part of society just because it just hurts if you're trying to hope for things that are not possible. And so we've seen that kind of window of empathy, but at the same time, there's a part of me that always fears that this window is about to close like very soon, and I'm seeing that backlash actually happening right now. So it's a little bit of both. I've never received more appreciation for my work than in the last couple of months, but I've also never received as much violence, because when you get more visible, you're also more exposed. And so it's a mix of those two, and it's people who are trying to show that they're not racist and trying to give opportunities to the few Black people that they know on one hand, and on the other hand, the suffering that's still going on. I was just learning yesterday, actually the Quebec government has been actually resisting. Basically, there's a lot of essential workers, people who are in the front line, people who've been working with elders here in Montreal, who are actually people without status, people who crossed the border from the US at the Roxham Road in 2017, 2018. So people who've been waiting to hear back. And so now those people without status, many of them have put their lives on the line because of COVID-19. And actually Justin Trudeau was ready to regularize a lot of them as a way to say thanks, and the Quebec government has been trying to make that program as small as possible. And now we're hearing that there are some people, for example, this one guy from Côte d'Ivoire, his name is Mamadou Konaté, who's about to be deported. He's taken in custody, and he actually caught COVID while he was working basically as a janitor in an elderly care home in Quebec. And Legault has made it that the program for regularization of status only applies for folks who have been like orderlies, people who work directly in healthcare, but that the people who are in charge of maintenance, for example, in those same space, people who are cleaning up, so basically having the same exposure to the virus, are not part of this program. So you see that kind of inhuman stuff going on, while there's a part of the Black community like myself who's more privileged, who's like giving opportunity because Black people are fashionable. So it's like those two things that are very hard to reconcile, that are going on in the same time. And of course, the US election and whatever that means. And so it's just a very intense year and a very disorienting year. with extremes of positive and negative stuff, which is hard to kind of wrap your head around, is the way that I would describe it.
Thank you so much. And thank you to all of the panelists for kind of checking in with all of us and letting us see into your lives in the last 6 to 9 months almost. So the conversation today is going to be structured in 2 parts. First, looking at the roots and then the symptoms of anti-Black racism. And I think a really important place to start is the history of slavery in Canada. So according to Dr. Afua Cooper, who wrote The Hanging of Angelique, which is an amazing book that I recommend for sure every Canadian read, but just anyone who wants more history about slavery in Canada and also in Montreal specifically. Dr. Cooper says that slavery is Canada's best kept secret. And I'm shooting out this question to anyone who wants to answer, but how do you think we can explain the general lack of awareness of the fact that slavery was an institution that existed in Canada for over 200 years, with a mix of both Indigenous and African or Black enslaved peoples?
I'm not a historian, but I think part of it is that we constantly compare ourselves to the United States, where slavery dwarfed the economic, political, social, even religious landscape for the same time as it did in Canada. And so where you're living beside a monster when it comes to slavery, like in terms of, and I'm not saying in terms of brutality, because slavery as an institution is brutal no matter how small the numbers are. But when you're looking at just the structuring of a narrative, if you're constantly comparing yourself to a behemoth and a monster in terms of the strength and the power of the institution to shape the nation, then I think that's where a lot of the ignorance comes from. We're speaking, we look at slavery in Canada and we think about it relative to the United States. And in the United States, it dwarfed everything. It was central to every single aspect of American life, and slaves in the height of slavery in America greatly outnumbered white Americans. And that was a reality that never took place in Canada. And because of that reality, the approach, like imagine the fear of white Americans who are living in a country where you are enslaving Black people and they outnumber you. The amount of brutality that must have been visited on Black bodies to control a population that was larger than you is something that must have been extreme. We know that it was extreme, and we know that it is something that dimension of slavery didn't exist in Canada. So the dimension, I think, has a lot to do with why we don't think about slavery as being significant in Canada.
Go ahead, Emilie.
François-Xavier Garneau is the first historian of the first French Canadian historian, or the first historian of New France who was born here. And he wrote his book at the beginning of the 19th century, right after this British Lord Durham, said basically French Canadians have no history. There are people they should assimilate soon, blah blah blah. So basically, French Canadians were very insulted by that, and so François-Xavier Garneau wrote his first history of French Canada with a sense of like, we need to prove ourselves against the British. But he wrote it in a way that basically erased everything that was bad against inside French Canadian history. Because when you look at the history of Canada, basically it started in Quebec with the colonial history of it, and even with the British regime, most of the slavery that happened in Canada happened either in Quebec City or in Montreal, because this is where the elites of the colonies were, right? And so when you look at why the erasure exists, you need to look at why the erasure exists in Quebec specifically. And basically, this guy was racist, and he didn't want to talk about it. And everybody else based their every other historian based their research on his book for a really, really long time. So there are like ideological reason, but there's also very practical reason that this guy was a jerk, and everybody based their work on this jerk. And so there's a strong historiographical tradition of erasing history as a result of just this one individual. But also, I'll share that actually my high school in Quebec City was founded, I think, in 1650 something. But it was founded on the grounds of the house of the first settler, the first permanent settler of French Canada. His name was Guillaume Couillard. He's the ancestor of Philippe Couillard, the former premier of Quebec. But he was also the first slave owner of Canada. So his slave, was named Olivier Lejeune, and he arrived, I think, in the 1620s. And his house, where he was enslaved, was actually my basketball field in high school. And there's only, what you see is only there's a rectangle that they've put on the ground that is darker on that basketball field, and there's a plaque that says something about this is the house of the first permanent settler of French Canada, Guillaume Couillard, but there's actually no sign whatsoever that is also where the first Black person was enslaved in Canada, or one of the first in North America when you think about it, right? So there's no signs of that at all. And so even when you're from, the heart of where everything happened or where everything started at the very least, there's no also physical reminder. And so, and it's just a basketball field in the high school now. So I think it says a lot about just how basically that thing happened. It just it's the erasure is there constantly, but it's very much an ideological project. And when you look at the roots of that project, how it happened within French Canadian history, you see how basically the goal was always to look better than the British, and in some ways Canada is still prisoner of that debate, that never-ending debate between the French and the English. And one of the things I think we always tend to or take not as seriously as like all the impact that this kind of competition between those two groups of white people, how we're caught in all of this and how that contributes to actually erasing everybody else's history.
Thank you. Yeah, that recognition of history is vital. It's important. Just a reminder, everyone, if you have questions as we're going, please feel free to drop them in the chat and we'll address them later. Go ahead, Desmond.
Yeah, I just wanted to build on what Emilie just said about this being an ideological project. And I think that that's the thing that's important to remember, is that history is written the way that it is and prized over other histories the way that it is because it benefits somebody to do that. It's not an accident. It's not that we forgot to teach you. It's that certain stories allow for certain ideological frames to remain. In this case, white supremacy, colonialism, and the subjugation of Black people. It's fascinating how when we contrast Canada with the United States, like that, these are both groups of people that left France and England and came to this side of the world. And we're somehow to believe that even though that was a global project of colonization, that Canada just got exempted and we were nice here. I don't know why you would want to believe that, but when we look at what's happening today, it's the same thing. It's a little too rich, of course, to just suggest that we're just doing a poor job of teaching history. All of this is intentional. The complete ignorance about things like these statues to Sir John A. Macdonald and Wilfrid Laurier and others, which gets stirred up every time somebody tries to remove or challenge one of those statues. Cornwallis in Halifax, right? People show their ignorance because you see, like, that unquestioned, say nothing kind of emblem to white supremacy in the public square actually benefits white supremacy. It's not. I was saying, just as Anna Maria was talking about prosecutors, I was thinking about this too. Is it that prosecutors have realized that incarceration isn't a good idea or is harmful? Or is it that there is a greater thing at play, which is the safety of the ruling class and their fear of themselves and their families getting COVID that made them temporarily change behavior? Which is why when Emilie talks about the window closing, I totally agree. Like, the window is only open for a purpose that serves the powers that exist right now. I don't think that prosecutors have come to a revelation any more than I believe what we've been hearing all summer, which is that white people have had a revelation because they were allowed to watch George Floyd be murdered on camera. I'm offended actually by that idea that this is revelatory for people and that they're learning off of our pain. They're adjusting so that they can maintain, you know, in the state, in the case of, you know, state actors, prosecutors, cops, politicians, they see these crises and they think, well, how do we stay on top? And so I think that the ways that we're teaching our students in school or not teaching them, the ways that we're putting some monuments in the public square and erasing parts of history, the way that people in Halaman County right now near the Six Nations of the Grand River who want Haudenosaunee people to stop demonstrating on a land site there, they wrote a letter as the police board in Halaman County basically classifying Ipperwash as a model for how the police in OPP should be engaging with Indigenous people. That's an erasure of history as well, but it's on purpose because having to talk about the murder of Dudley George and the violence of Ipperwash, even though it's been so thoroughly documented in Canada, is not serving their purpose today of trying to push Haudenosaunee people off of their land. So we should never look at the erasure of history as just being a choice or an error or a mistake. Like we have to see it as Emilie said, which is an ideological project.
Thank you so much, Desmond. And I think I want to kind of build off of what you were saying and go to a question concerning the history of anti-Blackness and that greater awareness that we've seen over the summer with the murder of George Floyd, the murder of Breonna Taylor, and countless other Black individuals. And I'm wondering, Anthony, if I can get you to answer this. You know, to what extent has a greater awareness of that history of anti-Blackness in the US and a willingness to name systemic racism produced a climate that may be more conducive to more honest conversations about race?
Yeah, I would say for myself, it would be intellectually dishonest to suggest that it hasn't created a greater sense of awareness or created more space for these conversations. But when it comes to the folks who've suffered the injustices of disparate police violence for generations and centuries, the awareness is important. I don't want to diminish that. But at the end of the day, it's about accountability and effectiveness. What is this actually going to change for Black communities? What laws are going to be passed? What structures are going to be developed? How are we going to diminish the presence of police within communities? How are we going to revamp our systems of governance and power that have allowed this status quo to become so set in and become the status quo that it is? So to what extent? I think to an important extent, but that matters much less than the outcomes that flow from this moment and the ways in which communities are coming together, Indigenous folks, Black folks, folks who are standing and recognizing that these issues have existed for far too long. What can be done to respond to that from folks who sit within government, within media, within business, within spaces of learning and influence at the end of the day. So while that has happened, at the end of the day, I think we're at too early a stage to really mark this moment, even as a success. I think it's important, but there are many people who I've seen suggest that, well, this is great. There's so many people having the conversation. The conversation is key, as I said, but what's really critically important is that Black people stop being killed with impunity, that we don't have the kind of dynamics of predatory power being visited on Black people at regular rates. And that also makes me want to say, too, this is not just a US phenomenon. I'm sure all the panelists will speak to this as part of the reason why we're having this conversation. The Ontario Human Rights Commission in Ontario has actually had to launch an investigation into the Toronto Police Service that has been ongoing for the last number of years because of decades of disproportionate representation of Black people being not just stopped, questioned, and documented, but seriously injured, shot, and killed. And so it's convenient for many Canadians to look at the uprisings in the United States and say, oh, this is horrible, this is not something that we would condone here. And yet still at the same time, we have Canada's largest police force being under investigation in this way. And I should note that it's under this kind of investigation because there have been years of the Ontario Human Rights Commission trying to engage the Toronto Police Service to find meaningful ways to address these challenges, to no avail. And so the commission had to exercise legislative powers to compel certain information and documents to pull that out. And so while that's just Toronto, if we're having a conversation around anti-Black racism, it's important to think about, not to the exclusion of other spaces, but where some, I believe the last count is about 70% of Black people exist on this side of the 49th parallel. And again, that's in no way to erase the experiences of Black folks across this country, but I don't think it's a stretch to say that other jurisdictions get a sense of how they're allowed to treat Black people based on what happens where Black people are, where there's a highest population, the highest concentration of Black people. And so I think it's important for us to think about that when we talk about this awareness and not become overly focused on the United States. And that also reminds me of a point based on the previous question, an idea that I've written about called Canadian racial exceptionalism, where it's become a national trend to pivot to Canadian racial exceptionalism. So the suggestion that we do not have racial issues, or if we have them at all, they're much less significant, or they're less intense, brutal, and violent. But tell that to the people who are experiencing the violence, and that's incredibly uncaring, it's callous, and it's its own kind of psychic and emotional violence. And so we should be very cautious about uttering things like that and moving with that kind of attitude.
Thank you. I want to ask a question about police brutality and accountability. And Anna Maria, I'm wondering if I can get you to answer this one. In the face of like countless examples of police officers claiming they feared for their life and reacted in self-defense, if we can talk about Breonna Taylor, as well as the assault of Devontae Miller in Toronto. Can the blame be placed on the law as upholding this narrative of impunity?
Yes, absolutely. It's more than a narrative of impunity. It's more insidious than that. It's rules of evidence. It's rules of procedure. It is presumptions that exist in our law that are designed to create a legal system that values the word and the testimony and the experience of certain people over others. And even though we have this myth, the narrative, actually the overwhelming narrative of our justice system, when you ask actors in the justice system a question like, is the word of a police officer more believable than the word of a civilian witness? They will tell you, no, it's not, because that is the narrative that we've told ourselves. But if you look practically at the rules that we've designed, how we determine who is credible and who is not credible, how we assess a person's worthiness of being believed, those are all things that are deeply ingrained and embedded in our justice system that we have to actively fight against in order to overcome. So the task for changing that really falls squarely within our justice system, on actors of our justice system. And it's people like me, and I've tried to do this in my work, is to call it out when I see it. For example, and this is like, I'm as a practitioner of law, I don't like theorizing much. I'm very much about precision and specific examples. So when I see in a court of law a particular example of somebody being, not believed well enough because they have an accent, a particular type of accent, or they're seen as not sophisticated because they speak with a particular kind of slang, we've got to call those things out, because those things add to the rules and the procedures that create injustice. Okay, so I think that it's important to call out these underlying assumptions that we have about what credibility means, what a respectable person is, because those are the things that animate the outcomes ultimately of our justice system. They are the sort of subtle biases that we have that create a situation where a police officer off duty can beat somebody with a stick and still be found not guilty. There are the way that we approach issues of credibility, who we believe, why we believe them, and what are aspects of their characteristics that make them believable. Those are all things that I have to deal with, and the things that I challenge on a daily basis. And so absolutely the functioning of our society is really shaped by these rules within our justice system.
Thank you so much. Anthony, I wanted to ask you specifically about the project, Sentencing and Parole Project, and ask what are your hopes, or what are the hopes of the organization that will actually, or what are the hopes that this organization will actually help lead to improve sentencing and outcomes for Black Ontarians specifically?
Well, thank you for asking. So I was fortunate to team up with fellow racial justice lawyers, Emilie Lam and Faisal Mirza, and together we founded what's called the Sentencing and Parole Project. And in short, the idea, or the work that we do, not just the idea, the work that we do is to provide judges, decision makers, and parole boards with better quality contextual information about the individual that they're sentencing. And so currently the regime that we have with pre-sentence reports and the reports that go to parole boards, they are woefully inadequate. They don't give you a context for the individual who's being sentenced, especially when they are Black. And so understanding the socio-systemic realities of unemployment, low income, squalid housing conditions, poor schools, you name it, those number of incidents coming together or realities coming together are rarely factored in effectively to help judges make fair and just decisions, which is a part of what judges are supposed to do. And so what the project aims to do is provide what are called enhanced pre-sentence reports. And these reports look into the individual's sociosystemic background, whether or not they were exposed to trauma and violence within their community, whether they lived in poverty, whether they're from a family that experienced trauma through being refugees, whether they were streamed in schools. Look at those immediate factors and then contextualize them within the bigger systemic understanding of Black experiences to help judges understand how that individual's culpability or moral blameworthiness, we say, impacted the range of choices that they had. So no, not everybody who experiences poverty ends up taking up a gun, for instance, but you have different communities who will experience poverty in a way with a heightened presence of guns and then less opportunities to develop life circumstances beyond what they're immediately exposed to. And so our submission, our argument, the thrust of the work is that the judges have to consider this when they think about the moral blameworthiness of individuals and provide sentences accordingly, with the ultimate aim of reducing the overrepresentation of Black people who are incarcerated. And so right now, Black people are some 3.5% of Canada's overall population, but at last count, we represent almost 9% of the overall federal prison population. And there's a similar range of overrepresentation of Black people within provincial jails as well. And so the project aims to, in one small but we think important way, address that. But I have to say, the real shift, the real push, the real work is to create conditions so people are not coming before the justice system in the first place, so that Black people are not coming before the justice system in the first place.
Thank you, and thank you for that project. I'm hoping that it can be replicated across the country. It's immensely important. I want to, as we kind of have about 5 to 10 minutes left, I want to move to questions and conversations around the pandemic that we're in the midst of right now. Emilie, I want to ask you a kind of a Quebec-specific question. What do you think can explain the Quebec provincial government's refusal to release race-based data on COVID-19 infection rates? And this is despite claims by public health, the public health director, that communities of color, communities who are, disadvantaged are experiencing higher numbers, but there is that refusal to provide real data.
There's a lot of factors. I'd say I'd start with politically speaking. Of course, the Quebec Premier is just not interested in acknowledging that systemic racism is a thing. And there's a lot of reasons behind that. There's a I find it very childish reflex of every time somebody hears about a concept first in English, we cannot adopt that concept, we need to be distinct. So there's that. There is a sense of, when I was part of a group that started a campaign to have Quebec government address systemic racism in 2016, one of the things that was heard over and over, I was actually first said by the then leader of the Parti Québécois, was that systemic racism was a way to do a trial on Quebecers, basically put Quebecers on trial. And so there's this perception that it's about attacking French Canadian, and that's something that's French Canadians are very sensitive to because of their own history. That's also very real. And so I guess there's a weird mix. It's like because of French Canadian history, people are particularly sensitive to critiques that come from the outside. And because of racism, when you're not white, you're always perceived as an outsider. And so we put those two together, and it creates a particularly strong repulsion to addressing those kind of issues. It's like people react to people like myself and the people in the Black community and the Indigenous communities as if we were British lords or Westmount elites or Toronto elites. It's really fascinating the way that a certain generation hasn't resolved its trauma and is unable to actually listen to what we're saying as a result. But beyond that, there's also the very specific, I'd say, trauma around the AIDS crisis that very much affected the Haitian community in particular. So there are a lot of public health officials who were already in place in the 80s and the 90s, who saw how the Red Cross and the public health approach was very much about naming that a certain disease affected Black people more, and the trauma and the stigma that it created. And so I've been part of, conversations are very much unofficial as well with certain public health officials, for example, within Montreal and other levels. And basically there's also the trauma there. And you even see sometimes even an older generation of Haitian folks who remember that and who cannot imagine public health having data on race in a way that is not harmful. And who just do not trust science at all as a result. And so there's very much like and that's something that I haven't heard that discussed a lot, but like the shadow of stigmatization of Haitian and AIDS and Black people in general, but specifically Haitian, and how that carries on in a certain circle of public health experts who just don't want to talk about race at all because they don't trust themselves to be able to do it in a way that's ethical. And so there's a lot of like ongoing talks internally as well, in terms of trying to make that shift happen. And also just the wounds that have never healed within the Haitian community here as well, within a certain generation who just really do not want their data collected either. And so I'm trying to see that, well, if you that might actually make you sicker, or that's not helping you at all, and there's a way to do it well. But so it's a lot of basically trust that's being broken on all sides, and reparation and truth and reconciliation around the AIDS crisis that's never been done. And that's very much still a taboo here, but that definitely has an impact. And so you have that, which is a completely different conversation than just the denial of systemic racism and the inability to collect data, but you mix the two together and it creates a system that is so slow to move, despite the fact that, the UN's called for it, Toronto's been doing it, and the sky hasn't fallen on our heads. And I think Statistics Canada might start to publish some things as well. And I think that's what's going to save us all in some ways, is that other level of governments are going to do it before Quebec does it. And so, and the important thing is that the data gets there. At least that's what I hope for. And also there's ways, because it's been so long, but there's ways as well to like collect the data afterwards as well for us to have a clearer view of what's been happening in our community. So that doesn't help with the public health response, but at least that's my hope, is that at the end of the day, people will collect those goddamn data and we will have a sense of what happened and what was the truth. Even if we don't have it now, we will have it, and that brings me hope.
Thank you. And I want to ask just one last question before we move on to the Q&A, because I know that there are going to be some really great questions. As we see the resurgence of hashtag Black Lives Matter movement and movements in support of Black lives here in Canada, in the US, and across the world, and we speak to, we see renewed calls to rename, remove buildings that are dedicated to historic figures who supported racist practices and institutions in Canada. I'm wondering, as we are all having this conversation as part of McGill's homecoming, I'm wondering how universities like McGill, University of New Brunswick, Dalhousie, how they what role they can have in shedding light on the history of slavery in Canada, on anti-Black racism in Canada, a history into which their own legacies are often inextricably inscribed. I'm wondering if, Desmond, you can start, and then we can get a couple of the other panelists to finish off.
I think our institutions should abolish themselves. That's how they can help. I think they can stop sitting on the land that they've stolen and the land that they cultivated and the wealth that they cultivated with literal slave labor. The money that they hoard, the property and the territory, the enormous land holdings that all of these universities have that is not theirs to hold on to because they were all on stolen Indigenous territories. Anthony made an important point earlier about not wanting people to enter the criminal justice system at all. Until we abolish the criminal justice system, we're going to be having this conversation every month and every week and every year. We don't want the police to murder us, but until we dismantle the police forces and take away all of their guns and take away their badges and take away the legal criminal code right that says the police have the right to kill us. Why are we playing? Why are we playing? These institutions need to die. And the thing is, if we look back at the institution of chattel slavery, incrementalism was never the right approach for that. When we look at segregated institutions, schools, churches, unions, every single institution, incrementalism was never justice in those cases. So as the police continue to kill us, as we continue to be disproportionately the ones jailed, the ones falling behind or getting kicked out of school, the ones suffering negative health outcomes, as far as COVID is concerned, were we not telling the government before we started seeing the cases that we are that they were going to disproportionately affect our communities anyway? Is this an empirical conversation? No, it is not. But we want to have it both ways. We want the institutions to have a revelation for themselves, realize their wrongs, and we want them to lead a fight that they're not qualified or have the authority to lead. So I don't know what to say other than that. We have to fight an abolitionist fight, in my opinion, because trying to work with our oppressors and convince them that it's time to stop oppressing us has never worked and is never going to, and is demeaning to our humanity as Black people to begin with. We've tried all of those things. We've tried to negotiate, and it's not to say that interventions in the current harmful systems and institutions right now are a waste of time, in my opinion. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying they're unwarranted. I'm just saying if we have a goal, certainly our goal is not to mitigate all of the violence, it's to stop it from happening. And our ancestors got us here by formulating things that at the time were not seen as being possible. So if people hear me say abolish the university and give away all of its money and land, and they say that's not possible, good. That's why we're going to do it. That's the star that we're going to aim for, because everything else is a capitulation of our value as Black people. And we just have to stop doing that. And we have to stop asking these institutions to participate in their own process, which takes, as Emilie said, like such a long time because of all of the complications, because of even, Black folks within these institutions that want to say, no, I'll go into the institution and I'll play a role to help make it better. I saw a piece in Ottawa by Adam Muhammad recently who said that we should stand up for Peter Slawley, the police chief in Ottawa, because Peter Slawley is facing a lot of racist violence from his own police force. And yet, ideally, Peter Slawley doesn't want us to abolish that police force. He wants us to reform it in a way that we can all believe in and feel good about. So this is the conundrum that we're in 2020, is that even though a few of us have made it into these institutions, they continue to kill us regardless. And asking them to reckon with their own histories is too slow, and it's just not good enough for us as Black people. So that's how I'm feeling.
Thank you. Go ahead, Anthony.
Hey, yeah, so I think as it relates specifically to McGill, we can't have this conversation without thinking about the Dr. Kenneth Melville McGill Black Faculty Caucus, which has been very clear on what the institution can do to meaningfully address the histories of enslavement of Black people and the ongoing reverberations of that. So from my read and understand, Black professors number some anywhere 10 to 12, maybe 11, when McGill University has 1,700 professors. And at the same time, I'm proud of the institution for what I was able to do and my connectivity to it, so don't get me wrong on that. But we hold ourselves out as a global institution. If you put us in the same conversation with the other global institutions, they often have thriving Africana programs, Black studies, there's fellowships, there's whole kinds of ways that you can get a deeper understanding of the experiences, histories, and ongoing challenges of Black people. And so I think if we're thinking about the bicentenary of the institution, we have to really stop lying to ourselves. I know there's going to be a lot of folks, or there are a lot of folks watching this. There's a tremendous opportunity when it comes to being a donor and what you're supporting, and being vocal about saying, what's this about you having 0.5% Black professors at our quote unquote global institution, where Black students continue to have to fight for basic things to have their humanity recognized. There's, again, I'm speaking as an alumni, who's someone who's proud, but also in support of the Black Faculty Caucus, which, if we're being really honest, although yes, these are Black people who are in the institution, they experience a level of privilege that other Black people don't, they are still 0.5% of the population in 1,700. What I'm getting at is the level of threat, the level of scrutiny, the level of difficulty that they have to experience consciously and unconsciously, overt and discreet, to be able to stand up and actually vocalize the challenges as they exist. And so I don't think the institution, I don't think the alumni, I don't think the professors really have to go very far. Black folks have already come together, and actually have been coming together for decades, articulating what specifically needs to be done to reckon with the histories of anti-Blackness embedded in the institution.
Thank you so much, Anthony. And thank you so much to all of our panelists for lending your voice and speaking to the reality of anti-Black racism and how it's been made abundantly clear in the midst of COVID-19 and the pandemic of anti-Black racism itself. I'm going to throw it over to Shubi, who's going to moderate our period of questions. So go ahead.
Thank you. Well, yeah, I just want to echo Brittany's expression of gratitude. Thank you to all four panelists. Thank you to Brittany as well, honestly. Very, very interesting conversation and super critical insights were shared. So I will be moderating the Q&A, and I'm going to start off with one question that was sent by an audience member. it's on the topic of institutions. So we're just talking about McGill, UNB, Dalhousie, these esteemed institutions in Canada that have legacies that are imbricated in slavery, in anti-Blackness. Generally speaking, though, how do we engage and hold institutions accountable when they have mastered the art of performative allyship? Anyone, please feel free to jump in. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Really great question.
I'll go and just quickly say that this relates to what I was just mentioning about if the allyship is performative, what's going on behind it, right? If somebody is performing an alliance, an understanding, a willingness to help, that is because they actually don't intend to help and go as far as you're asking them to. And so that's the impasse that I think many of us are reluctant to acknowledge. You can't work with somebody who's not working with you in good faith. And we've seen corporations, every corporation sent me an email, in the last 3-4 months. Every corporation that I've ever bought something for in my life wanted to let me know now that they love them some Black people. Hey, we love you, Black people. Black people, we watched a guy get murdered and it made us reflect on how much we love you. It is a performance. So how do you negotiate in good faith with somebody who in a moment like this is willing to center themselves and their interests while saying, I'm reaching out to try and help you? This is on us as Black people. So we have to reject the offer of performativeness, and we have to say, give us what we're asking for. Body cameras for police officers who murder people. Body cameras, a pilot project in Toronto for body cameras where the police had a button that they could turn the camera on or off. Who the hell are we trying to play with here? But that's our money that they use to do these things. So do we want to watch a Black person die next time so that we can have an adjudication in the public about whether the death was, fair or not? I know that that's not what I am fighting for. And so I think that when you say no more violence and then the police boards say body cameras or anti-racism training, you say no. And I think that when corporations, so here's another one. We just heard that Trudeau's government wants to partner with banks now to give Black people loans. So we'll loan you at interest some money to help you during a pandemic. Where do these banks get all this money, by the way? Where did the banks get the money that they want to loan back to Black people now? Is that their money that they're going to kindly let us borrow for a little while? We have to reject these proposals because at the top of this is a capitalist system that is like, yeah, we've got a brand for your anti-Blackness too. We'll just throw it on the back of our players' jerseys. And the standards that you expect from us as corporate world and institutions is so low that you'll actually applaud when we put Black Lives Matter on a jersey because that's how little you actually even expect us to do. And then they will go back to exploiting the labor of the Black people that make them millions of dollars and billions of dollars. So we have to reject the performativity because it's not being done in good faith, period.
Thank you for that answer. Another one that I'd like to touch on, this is more in the context of, again, exploring the effects of the pandemic, as well as policing and enforcement of health orders during the pandemic. So despite the lack of race-based data being released on the enforcement of COVID-19 health orders, unlike in cities like London and New York that were very explicit in reporting on, the fact that some communities were being more policed than others, what can explain the fact that in cities like Montreal, enforcement of these orders was highest in the most racially diverse neighborhoods, which happened to just be those that were most affected by the virus? In addition to that, I also wanted to push this on to you guys, and I'd be very interested in hearing the input of Anna Maria, for example. What alternatives to punitive enforcement could have been leveraged to promote compliance with the health orders?
Yeah, so the first question relates to, well, why was there increased enforcement in racially diverse neighborhoods? Is because that's where the police are. You're going to find enforcement where you have the police. If you want decrease of charges, or when you want to see like where you have the lowest charges, it's the place where you have the lowest police. The police target certain neighborhoods for patrol and for enforcement, and when you look for crime, you're going to find it. So that's the answer to the first question. And in terms of the second question, I think that's less of this is more of a public health question. What measures alternative to criminal enforcement can be used? Support communities that are going through this. Incentivize them to make it possible for them to exercise the kind of health measures that are necessary for them to protect themselves. A lot of people were going out during the pandemic because they had no other choice. And if you have no other choice, you're going to take risks for yourself and for your family. If we don't have the supports in place, the basic income, you're going to take risks to yourself and to members of your family in order to do what you need to put food on the table.
Emilie, I think you wanted to provide input.
Yeah, I just wanted to say quickly, the neighborhoods that were most affected in Montreal by COVID-19 are the Black neighborhoods. They haven't collected public health data based on race, but they've collected neighborhood data, and you can see, I mean, it gets very granular in terms of even which block. So you can make the connection, and it's very, very obvious. But I want to say that the people are getting ticketed, yes, because the police is more present, but also because you cannot actually comply with social distancing rules when you are living in crowded buildings, when you are living in poverty. So it's not just a matter, there's a part of the answer that's there, but it's also more than that. It's also teenagers having nowhere else to go. So people hanging out in the park more because they don't have this fancy backyard. And it's also a lot of what was uncovered in this pandemic is that people would just assume that kids would just take their school from home. Well, they actually don't realize that in Montreal North, there's a lot of kids who don't have internet at home. And so when you close, for example, the libraries, which is where people would access the Wi-Fi, there's no way for people to actually study from home. So people gather, you've seen kids actually gather right in the building, in the front, like in the lawn, right in front of the library to be able to study, to catch the Wi-Fi. You have kids gathering at like McDonald's because that's where the Wi-Fi is and that's where they can study. And so, and then the police comes in there, you know, so there's a lot of factors, but it speaks a lot about the social determinants of health and how basically it's not like, yes, public health could have done a lot more awareness raising, especially the study here was very much like French only. It took them 3 months to realize that it would be great to actually, you know, have messages in multiple languages and reach people regardless of their mother tongue, for example. But regardless of that, is that when you are in communities where the rules, you cannot actually apply them because they're going to go nuts, or because there is violence at home, and for you to stay at home is actually endangering your life, or all of these other factors, right? It makes it hard to actually comply with the rule. It's more about making poverty, and then you're gonna have communities that can actually socially distance. Social distancing was always a privilege of the wealthy, and you've seen it in this pandemic more than any time before, I think.
Well, thank you to both of you for that answer. And just on that point, Emilie, so in Montreal and in Toronto, analyses have actually been done on this. So, for example, in Montreal, a CBC analysis revealed that up to June 8, 2020, the strongest correlation in the geographic distribution of COVID-19 infection rates was between the number of cases per 100,000 residents and the percentage of Black residents in a neighborhood. All that to say that the more Black people in a neighborhood, the more likely there are to be cases of COVID-19. And like I mentioned, that same correlation was found in Toronto, and that was according to an analysis by Global. So I have another question for you, Ana Maria, before you have to leave us shortly. Your background is in criminal law. You're a criminal defense lawyer by training, and then you also are the executive director of Cannabis Amnesty. So I was just wondering if you could speak to us a bit more on the criminalization of cannabis. So one question that I'd have for you is, to what extent were patterns of criminalization of cannabis in Canada reflective of the same anti-Black bias that persists in policing in the US. And one thing to think about, a key stat in this regard is, in 2017, according to Toronto Star, Black people with no history of criminal convictions were 3 times more likely to be arrested by Toronto police for possession of small amounts of marijuana than white people with similar backgrounds. So I was just hoping you could sort of speak to us on this glaring racial disparity that still arguably persists despite the legalization of cannabis.
So the racial disparity when it comes to the enforcement of cannabis laws in Canada is very well documented. The Toronto Star as well as Vice magazine have conducted a number of freedom of information requests and have analyzed data, and it's very, very clear that despite similar rates of use across the board among every single demographic of population across Canada, we have unequal enforcement of cannabis legislation against Black and Indigenous Canadians as well. So if you're an Indigenous person in Vancouver or Winnipeg, you are 9 and 7 times more likely to be arrested for possession of cannabis than if you're white. In Canada, in Toronto and in Halifax, you have 4 times greater likelihood of being arrested for cannabis possession if you are Black than if you are white. So the operation of systemic racism happens through the exercise of discretion by individual police officers, determining who they're going to charge with an offense for cannabis possession and who they're going to let go, because we know that this is a scenario what exists in the scenario is essentially that you have people who are committing this offense, possession of cannabis, all across the board. So white people are doing this, Black people are doing this. This isn't an offense where you have a larger part of the population being responsible for or doing this kind of action. I was, in fact, when I first went to post-secondary education and left my sort of very racially diverse high school and part of Toronto, and I met people who are from very wealthy white backgrounds for the first time, I was shocked at the degree of callousness and casualness with which they consumed drugs that I was so fearful of even going close to, because I knew that it meant that if a person like me is caught with that, that I would be immediately fined, immediately arrested, and immediately prosecuted for that. And going to an environment where I saw people who were white not have that fear, I understood for the first time what it was to have that kind of privilege, to not ever be worried that despite the fact that you are doing something that is technically under the law illegal, you will not be jailed, you will not be prosecuted for it. And so it's the exercise of discretion that makes that happen. It's that police officers believe that if a Black person does something, that it is a crime, and if a white person does something, that it is something to be forgiven, slapped on the wrist and moved on, because, hey, people make mistakes. And so what you see is that certain people are given chances, certain people are given compassion, and other people are being demonized. And that is something that is mirrored in the United States as well, but it was done in such an insidious and more direct, more violent way in the United States, but it's definitely something that is mirrored in Canada. This exercise of discretion, this exercise of compassion towards white people that make mistakes, and brutality towards Black people that make mistakes. And then again, query whether possession of marijuana is a mistake, but setting that aside, you have this disparate and different approach to this activity that causes Black people to be overrepresented in the arrest data, and then ultimately in our criminal justice system.
Great, thanks for that. Anthony, had I seen a hand raised?
Sorry, yeah, I just want to say quickly, it's really important that we recognize that whether or not it's possession of drugs or engagement with drugs or the pandemic or so COVID, we continue to see these overrepresentations of Black people, because the truth of the matter is it's not about the drugs, it's not about the pandemic, it's about the criminalization of Black skin. And also Indigenous people experience the same thing. If we look at the histories and the foundations of policing systems, so when we're talking about Indigenous experiences, We have to talk about the Northwest Mounted Police, which was deliberately constructed as a colonial force to manage, control, and if necessary, kill Indigenous people to be able to take over their land and set up what would become Canada. When we're talking about policing and Black people, you have to talk about slave patrols, literally going, scanning places to find Black people who had no right to be in a particular place because they were thought to be enslaved, or they were enslavable at any time. So even if they were quote unquote legally free, they could be kidnapped. Many non-Black people woke up to this reality with the movie 12 Years a Slave. It's not just that one individual who was subjected to that. There are many free Black people who could be kidnapped at any time. Within Canada's own history, we like to talk about John Graves Simcoe and the passing of the Slavery Abolition Act, 1993. That was spurred by the kidnapping of a Black woman and dragging her from Canada across into the United States. So when we think again about why these consistencies persist, we have to talk about the legacies of slavery and colonization and how they started to be replicated and crystallized within policing services. And so we hear people say defund the police, and many people want to dismiss them, and so that's crazy, that's absurd. But and I'd like to think many of the folks who had the opportunity to study at McGill, who are now alumni, who are there now, take an intellectually honest view of how we came to these systems, and those historical reverberations and what Saidiya Hartman, a professor in the States, calls the afterlives of slavery, they are very real, and they're just living with us. That's why it's called the afterlife. So when you look at everything from slave ships to plantations to factories to jails, you see very similar conditions of hyper concentration, over monitoring, control, brutality, and heightened levels of death. And there are different ways in which that continues to play out. And so if we really want to talk about removing our society of these ills, we have to come to terms with that very deep history and legacy as it manifests.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that complete answer as well. Quickly, Anna Maria, thank you so much for having joined us. I know you have to leave right now, but I sincerely want to thank you on behalf of the McGill Black Alumni Association. We really appreciate your participation in this event.
Unmuted. Thank you so much. It's been a great pleasure.
And just a heads up, to the panelists and moderator, as well as the audience, we will be going maybe 15 minutes late still. Obviously, it's 3:30 now, but there are just a few more questions that we wanted to get through. So if you can stick around till 3:45, that would be really great. I have another question from the audience as well. And then this, I think, Anthony, it'd be great to have your insights, but I'd also love to have everyone's thoughts on this. So again, Anthony, you're currently working as the manager of the City of Toronto's Confronting Anti-Black Racism Unit. So I just wanted to hear your thoughts on, do you think there is a presumption that cities are less racist than suburban areas or rural areas in the US? And is there that same sentiment in Canada? And then maybe we'll actually focus on the Canadian aspect first. So is there a presumption that cities are less racist or discriminatory than suburban or rural areas? And is that even justified?
That's an interesting question. I would say yes, there is that presumption. The presumption that if you have more people from different lived realities and backgrounds, then that will magically make people less racist. But if you focus on outcomes in education, employment, housing, healthcare, policing, and the justice system, rarely does that play out in reality. And so, yeah, it's a perception that exists. And I understand to some degree where it comes from. So if you do talk to racialized people, yeah, often they'll say that they feel more comfortable in more densely populated city spaces because there's more folks around them. But many of the cases that have galvanized, for instance, right now, the global movement for Black Lives, it's not all, it's rarely, overwhelmingly, it's major cities where these killings are happening. And so it's a perception that I think we all have to wrestle with. And again, I think it's because we're not keeping focused on what the real issue is, and the issue is anti-Blackness. And so whether or not it's high concentration or low concentration, we're all subjected to these media systems, normalized or standardized education systems, and social circles that are not equipped with having healthy, humane conversations around who Black people are, what we are. And so, not to say that there's absolutely no difference. I don't want to be heard as saying that, but to answer the question very directly, there is a presumption. But what I'm interrogating is the justified nature of it and whether or not that means anything for Black people who's on the receiving end of anti-Blackness.
Emilie, I think you wanted to share some thoughts on that.
Yes. Yes, hello. I just wanted to say that one thing that's often erased in that conversation is class. Black people who are in small town tend to be more privileged in terms of educational background than people who are in big cities. For example, here in Quebec, people who end up being in rural area, oftentimes it's people who are international students who come to university, for example, Université Laval, or there's also programs who are like, heavily specialized workers, engineers, whatever, who are needed in that mine somewhere. And there's other realities similar to that as well, definitely in rural Ontario and in the prairies as well. And so what you end up having in the cities is a sense of, Black population being, and poverty and racialization and racial classification being a lot more intense as well in big cities than it is in rural centers. And I think when we forget that, when we erase that, we tend to not understand clearly what the dynamics are. You can have people who grow, isolated, who miss the access to the Black community, but there's actually, you don't see necessarily the cluster of poverty of Black neighborhoods when you go in rural areas, and what you can see when you're certain suburbs of Toronto or Montreal. And I think it's important to note, because oftentimes, and that's like every group that I'm a part of, right? Because hashtag intersectionality, people people insist on the part of their identities that are oppressed a lot more than the other parts of our identities. And so I think sometimes within Black communities, we erase the aspect of class, and it definitely shows up in terms of, who's from which part of the city when they are from the city, and also who's not part of the city and who is, and all of those conversations, I think, become a lot muddy if we cannot name those dynamics.
Indeed. So I have a question for Brittany, actually. So, you moderated a conversation, and I wanted you to be the moderator because you ran the Legal Information Clinic at McGill. So obviously you have a background in public interest law. You have an understanding of how marginalized populations have access or do not have access to legal services and whatnot. So I did have a question for you. In your opinion, do you think anti-Blackness shows up differently in French versus English Canada? You grew up in Montreal, you've been here, you studied here. I would love to hear your thoughts on that and find out more about your experience when it comes to being a Black woman in Montreal and Quebec.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So as an Anglophone living in Quebec, that's already quite a unique, we're technically an official language minority, according to the government. And I think, looking at the way that I experience racism versus some of my like French speaking or Francophone Black friends in the city is definitely different. I think there is a commonality when you look at anti-Black racism in general. But when you're in a city like Montreal or in a province like Quebec, where oftentimes if you try to, like, let's say, speak English to a French-speaking person, they might not receive that well. And so I'm constantly aware of maybe the differential treatment I get. And I'm wondering, like, is it because I am Black? Is it because I'm speaking English? Is it a factor of both? Is it something else entirely? So I feel like, in a province where I'm part of an official language minority, it's an interesting kind of experience to always be on my toes and not really sure where a differential treatment or where discrimination is coming from. I think there are definitely conversations that can be had by Black people in Quebec at large, but I definitely think there are some are some key differences.
Great, thank you for that.
I just want to say, as a
yes,
Francophone who lived in Ontario for a while, I echo that, and it's very confusing. And so we're kind of mirrors here. So shout out.
That's great to have both experiences on this panel, so thank you. Desmond, I have a question for you now. How do you balance, and this is another audience question, how do you balance the two ideas that fighting anti-Black racism is something for white people, that white people should figure out for themselves, and not just rely on Black people's labor, i.e. expecting them to do the work of education, versus the second idea, the conflicting idea, having Black people own and actually lead the fight against anti-Black racism?
That's a good question. I just want to return quickly to something that was mentioned earlier about what could have been done rather than criminalization. One day I used the TTC in the middle of the pandemic. This is probably about 2.5 or so months ago. And there were people on the subway handing out masks to anybody who didn't already have one. This is in a city where people were threatened with hundreds of dollars of fines for not wearing a mask on the TTC at one point, and also were criminalized in the general public space for not wearing a mask, not social distancing. They started putting hand sanitizer on streetcars. Never seen that before. There's just so many things that we can do to increase the likelihood of stopping the spread of the virus that are not punitive things. But I just wanted to bring those up as examples because the reason that we don't invest more in the actual let's help you be safe, and that we invest so much in the let's punish you because we don't think you're being safe, is that what have we seen here in Ontario? We've seen that actually the government said we're going to relax our restrictions. We're going to let people go back to restaurants, bars, gyms, strip clubs. We're going to send the kids back to school. And now the cases are going up. And so the government doesn't want to take responsibility for the cases going up by their own actions to tell everybody it's cool, we're getting better, everything's fine now. They want a scapegoat. And so the punitive measures and the heavy fines, they are for scapegoating individuals rather than focusing on the government's choices to tell us all that it was safe and fine. I just wanted to introduce that.
No, thank you for that. That's a really great contextualization. I appreciate it.
Harm reduction is always better than punishment, right? Learning how to meet people where they are and provide them with what they need to be safe is always more effective. But the punishment then, when you have officers running up physically in people's faces to give them tickets, you're just spreading more COVID, but you're not caring about the COVID anymore because you just need a scapegoat. When it comes to this tension in the question between not wanting to have to do all of the work for white people ourselves, but then also not wanting them to, I guess, stand in front of us and kind of erase what we're saying and doing. There are some definite real conflicts here, but I think very often the things that white people, quite frankly, are trying to take responsibility for are not even like work that I'm interested in doing. Like, I'm serious about this. Like, sometimes you got to let them have it, because if you want to do the charity model approach but not engage with systemic racism, you can have that. I don't mind. But we want to stay focused as Black people on the things that we need to do. I think we need to communicate well, though. I mean, there was an experience that I heard of recently about a local group here kind of being worried about this exact thing, as like, are people who are saying that they're white allies kind of positioning themselves too much at the front of our struggle. And what I would say to that is, like, when people are doing the real work, they're doing the real work. People are delivering food during this pandemic, and they're not asking Black people necessarily to like give them a cosign or to get involved with them or tell them how to do it. They're just like, I see a need in this community and I'm going to do it. So I think that that's really good. I think that recognition is important for us because we're human beings and we all want to be recognized for the things that we're doing. But ultimately, we shouldn't be doing the things that we're doing because we need a sense of validation. The Bible, which I know is old school, but let's do it. The Bible says that when you engage in charity, the left hand shouldn't know what the right hand is doing. And I like that idea. There's always the reality that people's work is getting erased, that people's work is getting taken and appropriated or just plain out stolen and attributed to others. So I'm not talking about that kind of thing. That kind of thing we absolutely have to be on guard for and we have to address. But my real conflict is not that white people are taking credit for the real radical stuff. It's that they're actually doing things that are very trivial and trying to big themselves up for that. And they're taking attention away from more systemic and more undermining, revolutionary, if you want, kinds of ideas and practices. So that goes back to the stuff about performativity. You know, we've seen a city council here, a city council in Toronto, for example, that, as I mentioned, just voted to increase the police budget. After all of this talk about defunding, they voted to increase the police budget for the sake of body cameras. I dare say that the politician that led that fight, Josh Matlow, would like to take credit for having done that. And I think he's about to run for mayor himself, actually, and that he's going to remind us as Black people later that he asked for 10% less police budget and failed, of course. But he's going to try and do exactly what your questioner is asking, which is try to represent our own work of bringing that attention to the fore back to us in a completely watered down and harmless form. So I say to Josh Matlow, don't try it. But I also say, like, if white folks, if that's the level of so-called intervention and disruption that they are interested in, we're actually fighting two different fights. And when people want to be performative and when people want to stand in front so that they can take up space without doing anything, we just have to repivot back to, like, what's the real work that we want to accomplish. Miriam Kaba just wrote this amazing piece yesterday about policing and about changing the questions that we ask to get to abolition. I would highly recommend that people read that because there's so many pitfalls in trying to do this work and so many people who are trying to distract us by lessening and weakening our demands, which is what we don't want.
Thank you very much for that. Sort of changing topics a bit now. Emilie, you had started off when Brittany had asked you about how you're feeling. You had talked about the case of Mamadou Konate. So I sort of want to have, this is a question that talks on the historical practice and ongoing practice of settlement of Black individuals in Canada. So in your book, Desmond, you detail the historical parallels between the November 2017 deployment of government envoys who were tasked with discouraging migrants who were in the US from coming into Canada through unofficial entry points like Roxham Road. You parallel that to the tactic that was used in the early 20th century to send government officials to discourage Black migrants from coming to Canada. Very clearly similar aspects. And you talk about how this is a depiction or manifestation of anti-Blackness or fear of Blackness. So I just wanted to get everyone's thoughts on what's currently going on in Quebec and in Canada overall, but specifically I think the conversation is stronger in Quebec with this whole idea of les anges gardiens, which, to your point, Emilie, these are essential workers who oftentimes were asylum seekers, a number of whom came to Canada through unofficial crossing points like Roxham Road, who were signed up for temporary labor placement agencies, were placed in the CHSLD, so the long-term care homes, and were really the people who are at the front line fighting the pandemic. A number of these individuals have now been allowed to, apply for permanent resident status, but a number of them have been excluded from this opportunity because they're not considered these anges gardiens, so these guardian angels. So I just wanted to get your thoughts on to what extent do current practices in Quebec of asylum workers, again, being placed in these temp labor agencies, having to do these jobs that are at a greater risk of contracting COVID-19, who are also living in very precarious housing situations where they could be living with multiple generations in the same home, so the risk of transmitting to someone with underlying conditions could be increased. To what extent does this whole system or structure really speak to anti-Blackness and, again, this fear of Blackness?
I want to start because I have all of you guys here with a strategic note. I think the only way we're going to get out of this mess, because there was really a will, actually, for once, of trying to have a program that would be wider than the one that's been put in place. And the reason why that wider program hasn't been put in place is because although the federal government is responsible for refugees, there is this tradition of like, oh, we lost someone. There's this tradition of consulting with the Quebec government because it's a shared responsibility in other aspects of immigration is a shared responsibility. And so it's because the Quebec Premier has a say and they made it a Quebec issue only, that François Legault has been able to be like, no, we're not going to be generous. And I think his line is actually, where do we draw the line, right? Like we need to draw the line somewhere. And that's kind of his argument. But if it was only up to the federal government, actually, we would be in a different situation. And so the only way that I see this issue moving is if there are other cases actually in Ontario or elsewhere, so that it's like taken out of the hands of François Legault because it's not framed as a Quebec issue anymore. Because if it was framed as a national issue, as a federal issue, then actually the thinking of Trudeau's then was actually to make it wider, and he was ready to announce it, a wider program earlier, and then it dragged on for 3 months because Legault didn't want that. So basically, just take basically the matters out of Legault's hand at all is like what I see strategically as the only way forward. And local organizers here are very much just focusing on Montreal. And so I think if we want to make people's lives better on this, we really need to like widen the fight and stop framing it as a Quebec only issue. I think is the strategic way forward. Because I mean, to your question about anti-Blackness, it's so obvious what it is. The fact that we get to work for cheap and that are also disposable. It's been the history of our people on this continent since 1492. But there's also, I found really interesting statistics that just like they were always there, but Statistics Canada has been trying to put forward those reports recently, and there's actually some really helpful gems in there. And actually, you can find that in terms of first generation, so immigrant Black women in Canada, 1 in 2, 50% of immigrant Black women in Canada work in healthcare. That's a lot. You can try to do the other way around, trying to find a proportion of Black women, of healthcare workers who are Black women or Black people. But if you look at the proportion of Black people who are healthcare workers, you can see how it affects our community so much, and how if like 1 in 2 women first generation is on the front lines, obviously the virus is circulating in our communities, obviously. So yeah, but I think your question is just, is it anti-Blackness? Yes, obviously. But I just think, because there's also a lot of people on the line. I mean, McGill alumni, especially in law, there's a lot of people who have a lot of power. So that's more like I'm using your question as a way to do some sort of a call to action. The more we keep focusing this as a Quebec only issue, the more it's actually losing battle. We really need to like get this out of the hands of this premier, because this premier is hopeless. And the way to do that is to make it a federal fight and a national fight.
Perfect. Thank you for that. So we are at 3:55 and we'd like to wrap up at 4. So I would have one final question for anyone who'd like to answer. We've sort of been touching on this from the get-go, and I think, Anthony, you had dubbed this in your own words, this idea of Canadian racial exceptionalism. So this is another audience question. What are steps that we can take to counter Canada's angel complex or Canadian racial exceptionalism? So in order to dismantle the sentiment that we're less racist than our American neighbors?
At the risk of oversimplifying, I think starting with recognizing that Canada does have its own deep-seated racist history and continued reverberations. When we take a moment to accept that and interrogate the fact that we are trafficking our national identity on a false sense of superiority, my hope and thought is that we will start investigating a bit more into the ways in which Canada has been particularly perverse to Indigenous people, to Black folks, to racialized folks, and how that has largely shaped the development of our country. So it takes a lot of collective national soul searching, and then also pressing our formal institutions to tell the truth. And I opened talking about my daughter a bit, and she's very young, but I do think a lot about the experiences that she's going to have within education, how she's going to be shaped and formed to think about this country in a certain way if myself, her mom, our families don't aggressively help to tell her the truth. We are collectively engaging in this very problematic process of lying to our kids and then wondering, well, why is there poverty and homelessness? Why do these racialized and Black people and Indigenous people keep getting shot? Why do they live in these housing conditions? We've been teaching our folks to think that this is okay and that this is normal. And that, for instance, looking at a legislature that is overwhelmingly white, looking at boards of corporate organizations that is overwhelmingly white, looking at courthouses that are overwhelmingly white when it comes to people who have jobs, looking at teachers lists that are overwhelmingly white, looking at sports ownership lists that are overwhelmingly white, media institutions that are overwhelmingly white. We're all socialized to think this is normal. But rarely do we stop and think, well, what if all these people just happen to be Asian? Everybody would be like, whoa, what happened? Something's wrong here. Right? Same thing with Black people or Indigenous. It's, oh, it must be some sort of program. Yeah, it's a program. Right? So we've all been indoctrinated, even the best of the ones who've gone through McGill and other institutions, to think that white people do have a monopoly on power, smarts, and achievement. And so really disrupting that, I think, requires us to stop, think, and be real and honest and say, Canadian racial exceptionalism is real. Now let me Google algorithms. Sometimes they get you a lot of trash information, but they also can help you get some really good information. It's increasingly easy to get an honest sense of what has led us to where we are today.
Thank you for that. Does anyone want to provide some final words on that before I provide some closing remarks?
I wanted to say in response to Emilie's really important call to action just now around these Haitian immigrants who don't have status, who are doing some of the most dangerous work in Montreal and in Quebec right now, that I think that, you know, this really has a personal kind of implication for me because my mom is a nurse and because that statistic, Emilie, about nursing is like half my family, right? My father's a retired mental health nurse. My aunt and uncle, both who worked in Canada, nurses, working mostly with seniors, by the way. This is very close. And so I think that healthcare workers across the board really had a deep sense of uncertainty and lack of equipment, lack of planning that has been exposed by this, and there are natural allyships and partnerships to be built across provinces to talk about that. And I also think that the food systems in this country and immigrants from the Caribbean and from Mexico who are brought here and who were brought here when we were told the border was closed, but the border was never closed for cheap labor from Mexico and the Caribbean so that Black and brown people could come here and continue to grow and harvest our food so that we had a safe food supply during a global pandemic. There's allyship across sectors between things like healthcare workers and food production workers, because it's the same thing. There's going to be a special tonight on W5 about the horrific conditions that people working on our farms in Ontario are facing while they continue to produce that food. No social distancing. If you get sick, you get sent home. If you complain, you get sent home. There's no health care. There's no legal protections the way that we have legal protections as citizens, those of us who are citizens. So I think that there's a very important alliance to be built. And I want to end by saying that this is what status for all really means. And this is where it becomes something that is a national call to action. Because if it's okay for people to come here during this deadly time and take care of elders and grow food and drive bus and taxi and sweep floors and put themselves at this risk, if they're good enough to come here and do that, they're good enough to be citizens upon arrival. And people get status on arrival to Canada. It is a thing that the government just chooses to grant in some cases and not in others. So it's not at all beyond our reach. And I wanted to end by saying that a status to all movement that exists here in Ontario with janitors, with migrant farm workers and others, that we need to help expand those connections between and across sectors and make the status for all movement a fearsome national thing that's going to make government sit up and pay attention.
Well, thank you very much, Desmond. On those notes, I will conclude the panel. So again, I thank you, Desmond. Thank you, Anthony. Thanks, Emilie. Thanks, Brittany. I really, really appreciate all of your involvement. I also thank Anna Maria, who's left. It's been a pleasure being able to hear you share your thoughts on, the reality of anti-Blackness in Canada, a historical reality, an ongoing reality, and something that's even more important to talk about in the context of the pandemic. And also how hearing you guys expand the conversation to also include elements of intersectionality and being able to stand in solidarity with Indigenous populations, as well as with other populations, to your point, Desmond, with regard to the status for all. I think it's critical that we understand that the movement for Black lives at the end of the day should also be for liberation for all peoples too, that should be the end goal fundamentally. So on that note, thank you all to audience members. Thank you for having joined us. This is the last event of the of McGill's at-home homecoming. Obviously, we would have loved for this to be in person, but the context of the pandemic brings us to having this online. But we still thank you for having joined us all the same. I just wanted to point out that next week we will be sending an email to all audience members, so all the participants, and it'll include a few key materials for you to check out, be it books that we've mentioned today, a few articles to read. The Public Health Agency of Canada just published a really fascinating exploration on social determinants of inequality and of health in the Black population. So these are really great resources to read. So we'll include that in the email. And I also wanted to give a quick note that this coming week, McGill administration, so McGill University, will actually be delivering or submitting their plan to address anti-Black racism. This is something that the principal, Suzanne Fortier, had mandated the provost, Christopher Manfredi. This will be coming out this week, is the expectation. As part of the McGill Black Alumni Association, we are planning on surveying our members to be able to get your input to find out what your priorities are for this plan. Obviously, it's not ideal that this plan was delivered in such a rushed manner and without necessarily, in setting a deadline that was not determined in consultation with the Black community. Therefore, we're going to take our own time to get the input of our community so we can provide this and ensure that our voices are represented in a plan that the university is putting forward to address anti-Black racism. I would also invite you to check out the website of the Dr. Kenneth Melville Black Faculty Caucus. They have an incredible statement on their own priorities for this plan. The link to that statement will be included to the email that we'll be sending out. You can also find out more information about the McGill Black Alumni Association on our Facebook page, as well as in our LinkedIn group. Just search McGill Black Alumni Association. Finally, I'd like to thank the McGill Alumni Association and the university for providing space for an important and timely conversation. This has been tricky to coordinate, but I really, really appreciate this. Desmond, did you want to jump in quickly? Or
I just, again, wanted to thank you for the incredible work that you did to make this possible, Shubi. And thank you so much for hosting us and moderating us. And it's Migrant Workers Alliance for Change, if I didn't mention that, which is one of many groups in Ontario who are doing some of that status for all work that I was talking about. I just wanted to mention Migrant Workers Alliance for Change. So thank you so much.
Thank you. So I thank all of you for, again, and then Marie as well for having joined us. And I just wanted to remind, as Anthony had mentioned in the beginning, next year, so 2021, is McGill's 200th anniversary. So it's very important that we're having these conversations, and very important that we have an honest space to discuss what McGill's legacy is as it enters its 300th century, or its third century, 300th year. So I'm very, very grateful for this opportunity. So I thank you all for your participation, and I thank you all for attending. And on that note, that concludes this panel conversation, and that concludes Homecoming 2020. Thank you.